Michael wasn't late arriving at the warehouse that morning. He was exactly on time, as always. 5:45 in the morning, 15 minutes before his shift began at 6 o'clock. He'd been doing this for 8 years. 8 years of arriving early, leaving late, and still feeling invisible. The fluorescent lights hummed their tired song above him as he clocked in, his worn ID badge swinging against his chest like a pendulum counting down moments he couldn't get back. Nobody noticed him then. Nobody noticed him now. His job was simple. Sorting. Moving packages from one conveyor belt to another, scanning barcodes, directing items to their destinations. It wasn't the kind of work that made headlines or impressed people at dinner parties. When people asked what he did, he'd simply say, "Logistics," and they'd nod politely before changing the subject. They didn't need to know about the repetitive motions, the sore shoulders, or the way his wrists ached by noon each day. They didn't need to know that Michael thought about every package he touched, that somewhere, someone was waiting for that delivery. Someone was excited. Someone cared. But Michael moved slowly, methodically, ensuring nothing was ever damaged. He checked twice where others checked once. He verified every scan where others assumed accuracy. This meticulous nature was who he was. A careful man in a world that only valued speed. The warehouse manager, Derek, had made this abundantly clear in Michael's last performance review. "You're reliable," Derek had said, not meeting his eyes. "But you're slow. In this business, slow is expensive." Michael had nodded, understanding perfectly. He'd heard it before. The younger workers moved like they had fire in their veins, rushing through tasks, and Derek celebrated them with bonuses and promotions. Michael celebrated staying employed. His apartment was small. His car was used. His life was modest, but it was honest. That Tuesday morning started like any other. Michael pushed a heavy cart of packages toward the sorting station. His movements fluid from 8 years of repetition. His co-workers flew past him, young men, and women with earbuds and ambition, their fingers flying across touchscreens with practiced speed. Michael took his time. He read each label carefully. He stacked each box with precision. By lunchtime, he'd sorted exactly 417 packages. By 4 o'clock, 523. His numbers were lower than everyone else's, but his damage rate was 0. His error rate was virtually non-existent, and absolutely nobody cared. What Michael did in his silence, in the spaces between his careful movements, was observe. He noticed inefficiencies that others had stopped seeing. He watched how packages got damaged when they were thrown carelessly onto moving belts. He noticed how misdirected shipments caused bottlenecks downstream. He watched the system break and break again, hemorrhaging money through preventable mistakes. And in his mind, piece by piece, an idea was forming. Not during work, but at night, in his small apartment, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the problems he could see so clearly, but nobody would listen to. Michael had always been like this. As a child, he was the quiet one who noticed when things didn't work right. He was the one who asked questions that made teachers uncomfortable because the answers they'd given were incomplete. His parents had called him thorough. His school counselor had suggested he was cautious to a fault. His first girlfriend had left him, saying he thought too much and felt too little. Though the truth was, he simply felt things differently, more intensely perhaps, more internally. He'd spent his whole life being told that his way of thinking was a limitation, that he needed to be faster, less careful, more aggressive. But what if his way of thinking was actually his greatest strength? What if he'd just been waiting his whole life for the right moment to prove it? The warehouse was his prison and his laboratory. While others clocked out at 5:30 and raced toward their Friday nights, Michael stayed late. Not because he was asked to, but because he couldn't help himself. He began taking photographs of the sorting process. He made notes on scrap paper about timing and flow. He sketched diagrams showing where deliveries got delayed. His apartment walls became covered with plans written on notebooks and scribbled on the backs of envelopes. His neighbors thought he was strange. His own sister had stopped asking what he was working on because his explanations were too detailed and her interest too limited. But Michael couldn't stop. This was who he was. A man who thought deeply, who cared intensely, and who refused to see the world's problems as someone else's burden. He had no idea that everything was about to change. He had no way of knowing. That his slowness, the very thing that had held him back his entire life, was actually a prophecy of what was to come. In less than a week, Michael's world would shatter. His invisible life would become impossible to ignore. But first, there would be devastation. First, there would be loss. First, he would have to reach the very bottom before he could ever climb back up. The email came on a Wednesday morning at 8:15. Michael had been at work for an hour and 40 minutes. He was halfway through his second cart of packages when Derek appeared at his sorting station with an expression that wasn't quite sympathy, but wasn't quite cold either. Something in between, something worse. A resignation that this was simply business, nothing personal. Michael's stomach dropped before Derek even spoke. "Michael, I need you to come to my office." Those 7 words. He'd heard them in movies, in television shows, in other people's tragic stories, but hearing them directed at him, delivered in Derek's thin voice, made the world suddenly smaller. Michael followed Derek through the warehouse, conscious of every eye watching him. He was never the center of attention. Being noticed now felt like drowning with an audience. Derek's office was a glass box overlooking the warehouse floor. Everyone could see inside. Everyone would see this coming. "I'm going to be direct with you," Derek said, closing the door. "We're implementing new performance metrics. The company has been reviewing efficiency data across all our facilities, and we need to make adjustments. Your sorting speed is significantly below our operational targets. You're in the bottom 10%. Michael's fingers trembled slightly. He pressed them flat against his legs. "My error rate is the lowest in the warehouse," he said quietly. "My damage reports are virtually non-existent." "I understand," Derek replied, and he did seem to understand. This was perhaps the cruelest part. Derek was a decent man doing an indecent job, but in our analysis, the cost of your slower production rate exceeds the value of your damage prevention. It's simple math. The company's made a decision to part ways with employees whose output doesn't meet the new standard. The numbers. Of course it came down to numbers. A man wasn't a man. He was a spreadsheet. 8 years of reliable service, 8 years of never calling in sick, 8 years of caring about every single package. None of that mattered. It was all reduced to speed, to productivity, to the simple equation of money in versus money out. Michael felt something break inside him, but his face remained still. He'd learned long ago to hide his emotions. "When?" Michael asked. "Today is your last day." "I'm sorry, Michael. We'll provide 2 weeks of severance. We'll give you a reference if you need it." The walk back to his station felt both eternal and instantaneous. Michael logged off his computer, gathered his few personal items. A framed photograph of his parents, a coffee mug that said, "World's Best Worker," ironically given to him by his sister years ago, and left the warehouse without saying goodbye to anyone. Nobody called after him. Nobody asked where he was going. Within hours, someone else would be assigned to his station. Someone younger, someone faster, someone whose name nobody would remember in a year. His apartment felt different when he returned. The walls seemed smaller. The silence seemed larger. Michael sat at his kitchen table staring at the severance check, then at his bills piled in a drawer, then at nothing at all. He had 2 months of savings if he was careful. 2 months to find another job in a market that didn't value people like him. 2 months to prove that his life meant something. But something unexpected happened in the darkness of that failure. Instead of despair, Michael felt a strange clarity. For 8 years, he'd convinced himself that the job was temporary, that he was just waiting for something better to come along. But nothing had come along because he hadn't made it come along. He'd accepted the role of the invisible man. He'd agreed to be overlooked. Well, no more. If they didn't want him, fine. But he'd spent 8 years in that warehouse. He'd seen everything that was wrong. He'd mentally solved problems every single day. And he had documentation. He had notes. He had sketches. He had a complete blueprint of a solution that could revolutionize the entire operation. Michael stood up from his kitchen table. He walked to the corner of his small bedroom where a cardboard box held all his notes and sketches. Years of accumulated observations about warehouse inefficiency. He'd written down every pattern he'd noticed, every moment wasted, every bottleneck in the system. Without even fully understanding why he was doing it, Michael began to organize his notes. He created categories. He drew clearer diagrams. He started to write what would later be called a business plan, though he didn't think of it that way. He simply thought of it as the truth about how things could work better. That night, Michael barely slept. His mind was racing. For the first time in years, he felt alive. Not happy, not yet, but alive. Purposeful. The terrible day that had destroyed his employment had somehow freed something inside him. And as he stared at his sketches and notes spread across his small apartment floor, an impossible thought began to take shape. What if being fired was the best thing that had ever happened to him? Michael had never thought of himself as an inventor. Inventors were people in garages who tinkered with electronics, or people in labs surrounded by advanced equipment. Michael was just a warehouse worker with careful hands and a mind that wouldn't stop asking questions. But in the 2 weeks following his termination, he became obsessed. He transformed his apartment into a workshop. He used his severance money to buy used materials, tools, and components. He watched YouTube videos at night, learning about engineering principles and mechanics. He taught himself CAD software using free online tutorials. What Michael was building was deceptively simple in concept, but revolutionary in execution. The warehouse operated on a basic conveyor belt sorting system that hadn't been fundamentally updated in 30 years. Packages were placed on belts, scanned manually, and redirected by workers. The inefficiency existed in moments of transfer. Those split seconds between one belt and another, where packages moved too fast and got damaged, or workers scrambled to direct them accurately. What Michael had designed was an intelligent automated gate system that could read barcodes at high speed while gently slowing packages just enough to allow for perfectly accurate sorting and transfer. It would reduce damage by 70% while simultaneously increasing throughput. It would replace human sorting hands, yes, but it would eliminate the tedious labor and allow workers to focus on more complex tasks. The system essentially did for warehouses what the assembly line had done for factories a century ago. After 3 weeks of work in his apartment, 3 weeks of living on ramen noodles and coffee, of barely sleeping, of sketches covering every available surface, Michael had a working prototype. It was crude. It was built from salvaged parts and held together with determination and duct tape. But it worked. He'd constructed a scale model in his living room, and when he activated it, when he watched the test packages move smoothly through the system without a single error, Michael wept. He actually cried. For the first time since being fired, he wasn't thinking about the warehouse anymore, or about failure, or about being invisible. He was thinking about possibility. The question now was, what did he do with it? Michael had no contacts in the industry. He had no experience running a business. He had no connections to venture capitalists or manufacturers. He was still just Michael, the slow man, the overlooked man, the man nobody listened to. But he had something real now, something tangible, something that worked. He spent the next 2 weeks creating a presentation. He learned about patent applications. He researched manufacturers and distributors. He practiced his pitch in front of his bathroom mirror, hating how awkward he sounded, hating how difficult it was to talk about his own work without underselling it. He'd spent so many years making himself small, so many years accepting the roles others assigned to him. Speaking about what he'd created felt like learning a foreign language. With his remaining savings nearly depleted, Michael made a decision that terrified him. He rented a small booth at an industry trade show, a logistics and warehouse management convention that was happening 3 hours away. He paid for a hotel room. He drove through the night. He set up his prototype at 6 in the morning and waited for the doors to open. The first person who stopped at his booth was a woman in her 50s, wearing an expression of professional skepticism. She represented a mid-sized warehouse distribution company. Michael showed her his prototype and explained his system. He watched her eyes change as she understood what she was seeing. She called her supervisor. The supervisor called the company president. By noon, Michael had received his first offer, $100,000 for exclusive rights to implement the system in their 3 facilities. He didn't accept it. Instead, he continued talking to other companies throughout the day. By the end of the trade show, Michael had received 7 serious inquiries and 3 formal offers. The highest offer was from a multinational logistics company, $500,000. Michael negotiated carefully, thinking of all the years he'd been undervalued, all the times he'd accepted less than he deserved. He held firm. He wanted more. He demanded better. And they gave it to him because what he had created solved a problem that cost them millions of dollars. Annually, the contract he signed 2 weeks later guaranteed him a base payment of $1.5 million for manufacturing, rights and installation assistance, with additional royalties on every unit sold. The contract included a confidentiality clause, which meant Michael couldn't tell anyone in the warehouse what had happened, couldn't prove to them that they'd made a terrible mistake letting him go. But that didn't matter anymore. The invisible man had become unforgettable. The slow worker had created something fast. The overlooked employee had designed something that every company in the industry now wanted. Michael moved out of his small apartment and into a house. He hired lawyers and financial advisors. He watched his bank account grow beyond anything he'd ever imagined. But money, he quickly discovered, wasn't the point. The point was something deeper and more profound. Michael had learned the truth about himself. Every person who had ever told him he was too slow, every manager who had ever criticized his meticulous nature, every person who had made him feel small had been wrong. His slowness wasn't a weakness, it was his superpower. His careful observation had unlocked a solution that faster minds had missed. His patience had allowed him to see patterns that rushed thinking couldn't perceive. All the things the world had told him were flaws were actually features. And now, finally, he understood. Rejection wasn't the end of the story. Sometimes it was the beginning. Michael sat in the conference room of his new company. Yes, his own company now. And watched the presentation being given by his manufacturing partner. The screen showed projections of their market expansion. 18 months after the first sale, his warehouse sorting system had been installed in 247 facilities across the continent. The technology had become industry standard. Companies were saving millions on damage reduction and increased efficiency. Employees were being retrained for more meaningful work instead of standing on conveyor lines all day. The world was becoming slightly better because Michael had decided to pay attention. He'd hired a small team to help him manage the business. People better suited to sales and marketing than he was. But Michael remained the creative force, constantly improving the design, constantly thinking about what could work better. He'd also done something unexpected. He'd started a grant program for people like himself, people who worked in warehouses and distribution centers, people whose contributions were overlooked, people who had ideas but no platform. He wanted to give others the opportunity he'd nearly missed. One afternoon, almost 2 years after his termination from the warehouse, Michael did something he'd been dreading and anticipating for months. He drove back to the warehouse where he'd worked for 8 years. Derek was no longer the manager. He'd been promoted to a regional director position. A younger man named Thomas now ran the facility. Michael walked through the doors and requested a meeting. Thomas didn't remember him at first. There had been so many employees over the years, and Michael had always been forgettable. "I used to work here," Michael explained. "In sorting, about 2 years ago." "Oh right," Thomas said vaguely. "What brings you back?" Michael showed him the articles about his company. He showed him the patents. He watched Thomas's face transform as he understood. This was the slow guy. This was the one they'd fired for being too meticulous. He was now worth millions. More than that. He was changing the industry that had rejected him. "I came back because I needed to understand something," Michael said quietly. "I needed to know if I was right about all the inefficiencies I saw here. If I was right that this place was broken." Thomas looked uncomfortable. "Michael, we've actually already implemented your warehouse sorting system here. We installed it 8 months ago. We've cut our damage losses by 68% and increased our throughput by 42%. It's transformed our operation," Michael nodded slowly. The warehouse that had fired him for being slow was now operating using his system. They were benefiting from his careful observation without even knowing it was his. Somewhere in the building, there was probably another slow person, someone careful and meticulous, someone being told they weren't fast enough. Michael wondered if that person had any idea that their way of thinking might be worth millions. "I'm glad it's working," Michael said, and he meant it. His satisfaction didn't come from revenge or vindication. It came from knowing that he'd solved a problem that needed solving. The validation was internal, not external. Derek didn't need to apologize. The company didn't need to beg him to come back. Michael didn't need anyone's recognition anymore. He had something far more valuable. He had proof that his way of thinking was valid. That careful observation mattered. That slow, methodical progress toward excellence was just as valuable as fast, careless mediocrity. As Michael left the warehouse that day, he passed the sorting station where he'd spent 8 years. A young woman was working there now, moving through packages with deliberate care. She wasn't the fastest sorter on the line. Michael could tell by looking at her. She had that same quality he'd always had, the sense of checking twice, of thinking about each action. He wanted to stop and tell her something. He wanted to say, "Your speed doesn't define your value. Your way of thinking is enough. The world will try to make you smaller, but you don't have to accept it." But he didn't stop. He just looked at her for a moment, and she glanced up and looked back. There was no recognition between them. She didn't know who he was. She just saw an older man watching her work. Michael smiled slightly and continued walking. Maybe someday she would discover her own hidden talent. Maybe she would be told she was too slow. Maybe, just maybe, that rejection would become her liberation too. What Michael had learned through all of this, through the rejection and the struggle, through the sleepless nights and the desperate attempts to build something from nothing, was that value can't be measured in real time. You can't know in the moment whether something you're doing matters. You can't know if the careful attention you're paying is worth it. You can only keep doing what feels true to you, and trust that eventually, the truth will reveal itself. Michael had spent 8 years believing his value was low because a spreadsheet said so. He'd let other people's metrics define his worth. But value isn't something someone else can measure. Value is something you have to recognize in yourself first. 5 years had passed since Michael was fired from the warehouse. His company had expanded internationally. His net worth had exceeded $5 million. He'd recently passed that milestone and momentarily felt nothing, which surprised him. He'd imagined this moment so many times. He'd thought that reaching 5 million would feel like triumph. Instead, it felt like any other day. Perhaps because the real triumph had already happened the moment he decided to believe in himself. He received an invitation to speak at a conference about innovation and entrepreneurship. 3,000 people would be in attendance. Michael's first instinct was to decline. Public speaking terrified him. He was a quiet person. He wasn't good at crowds or attention. But then he thought about that young woman at the sorting station. He thought about all the other careful people, all the other meticulous thinkers, all the other too slow employees being told they weren't good enough. If he had a chance to tell their story, if he had a chance to help even one person understand that their slow, careful nature was a strength and not a weakness, then maybe he should say yes. The night before the presentation, Michael couldn't sleep. He stood on the balcony of his hotel room, looking out at the city lights, and he thought about the person he used to be, the invisible man, the one nobody noticed. That person was still in there somewhere. That person was still him. But now, he knew something that person didn't. Invisibility isn't weakness. Sometimes it's the best place to see everything clearly. Sometimes it's where genius lives. The morning of the presentation, Michael walked onto the stage and looked out at 3,000 faces. He was supposed to talk about innovation, about business strategy, about creating products that change industries. But that's not what he talked about. "I was fired for being slow," he began. And he heard a collective shift in the audience. People leaned forward. They put down their phones. "I worked in a warehouse for 8 years. My job was to sort packages. I was slower than everyone else. I was more careful than everyone else. My manager told me that slow was expensive. My company decided I wasn't worth keeping, and I was devastated. But here's what I learned. Being fired was the greatest gift my life ever received. It taught me that the world's measurements of me were wrong. It taught me that efficiency isn't always the highest good. It taught me that sometimes the most valuable thing you can do is pay attention. Sometimes the most revolutionary idea comes from someone taking time to really see what's happening. I built my company on careful observation. I noticed problems that faster minds had stopped seeing. I thought about solutions instead of just accepting the status quo. Every successful product we've created has come from this place. This slow, careful attention to detail. And now we're worth millions, but not because I sped up. Because I finally accepted that I was right all along. Because I stopped believing what other people told me about my limitations. Someone here is like I used to be. Someone here is being told they're too slow, too careful, too thoughtful. Someone here is doubting themselves because the world's metrics say they're not enough. I'm here to tell you, you are enough. Your way of thinking is valid. The careful attention you pay is valuable. You don't need to be faster. You need to be true to who you are. The world needs two kinds of people. Those who run fast and those who think deep. Both are essential. Don't let anyone convince you that you need to be something you're not. Your seeming weakness is probably your greatest strength. You just haven't found the place where it matters yet. But it matters somewhere. Your contribution is real. Your value is absolute. And the moment you stop accepting other people's definition of you is the moment everything changes. Michael stopped speaking. He wasn't particularly eloquent. His presentation had no fancy graphics or clever jokes. It was just a man telling the truth. And when he finished, 3,000 people stood up. They applauded. They cheered. But more importantly, later that evening, dozens of people approached him privately. People who were afraid they weren't good enough. People who'd been fired or passed over or made to feel small. People who needed to hear that their way of thinking wasn't a flaw. It was their future waiting to happen. One woman told him that she'd quit her job the day before because her boss had told her she was too slow. She was devastated, doubting herself. After hearing Michael speak, she decided to try freelancing in her field. 6 months later, she reached out to tell him she'd started her own consulting company and was earning more money than she'd ever imagined. Another person told him that after hearing Michael's story, he'd finally pursued the invention he'd been thinking about for years. He didn't sell it for millions, but he'd sold it for enough to change his life. And more importantly, he'd finally respected himself. Michael realized something profound in those conversations. His biggest success wasn't the money or the industry recognition. His biggest success was inspiring others to see their own hidden value. He'd been invisible for so long. Now he was using that experience to help others become visible, to themselves, if not to the world. The $5 million sat in his account, but Michael barely thought about it anymore. What he thought about was the young woman still sorting packages at the warehouse. He thought about the next careful person being told they weren't fast enough. He thought about everyone who'd ever accepted someone else's definition of their worth. If you're watching this and you're struggling, if someone has told you that you're not enough, if you've been passed over or overlooked or made to feel small, know this: the world's measurement of you is not your measure. The metrics that say you're falling short were created by people who don't understand you. Your careful way of thinking, your meticulous nature, your habit of paying attention to details others miss, these aren't flaws. They're your superpower waiting to be recognized. Michael's story doesn't end with $5 million. It ends with you. It ends with the question: what have you been told about yourself that you're ready to stop believing? What strength have you been treating like a weakness? What future are you afraid to claim? If this message resonated with you, if you see yourself in Michael's story, please comment below and tell us your story. Tell us about the moment someone told you that you weren't enough. Tell us how you're learning to believe in yourself anyway. And please, subscribe to this channel, because these are the stories that matter. The stories of ordinary people discovering their extraordinary worth. Because every single one of us has a hidden spark inside. The only question is whether we'll let it shine.